House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements. Extraneous material and questions for the record will also be accepted during that period, subject to the length limitations in the rules. To insert something into the record, please have your staff email the previously mentioned address or contact full committee staff. Please keep your video function on at all times, even when you're not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. Consistent with House Resolution 965 and the accompanying regulation, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they're not under recognition to eliminate background noise. I see that we have a quorum, and I'll now recognize myself for an opening statement. Pursuant to notice, we're holding a hearing today entitled National Security Implications of Climate Change in the Arctic. Last week, I had the privilege to attend the 26th UN Climate Change Conference of the Parties, also known as COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland. COP26 summit brought parties together to accelerate action towards the goals of the Paris Agreement and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. After 2 weeks of intense, and they were intense, deliberations, diplomats from nearly 200 countries reached a final deal to work together to stave off the worst effects of climate change for current and future generations. I personally was encouraged to see member states join forces with civil society, companies, and youth on the front line of climate change to inspire climate action in all areas of the world. COP26 has provided global direction to the world we must undertake to respond and mitigate the existential threat that climate change poses to our world. Now it's time to roll up our sleeves, get creative, and sometimes make tough decisions. And together, we must work to better understand some of the very real pressing national security challenges that global warming presents to strategically significant regions of the world. As such, we're here today to discuss the national security challenges that global warming is exacerbating in a region critically important to the U.S. and its Nordic partners, the Arctic. The United States is proud to be an Arctic nation alongside Canada, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and the Russian Federation. As a member of the Arctic Council, with economic, diplomatic, military, and environmental interest in the region, we bear a responsibility to mitigate the effects of climate change in the Arctic's lands, oceans, and most importantly, its peoples. For this reason, Ranking Member Fitzpatrick and I organized this hearing today to better understand the current state of the Arctic climate change and the implications on national security for not only the United States, but for our Nordic partners as well. The Arctic is categorized by distinctively polar conditions of climate, plant life, and animal life. It's a region rich in distinction for its cultural traditions and is a key component of the global economy. International interest in the Arctic and the subarctic regions has steadily increased during the 20th century for 3 major reasons. One, the advantages of the North Pole route as a shortcut between important centers of population. Secondly, the growing realization of economic potentialities such as minerals, especially petroleum, and forest resources, and grazing areas. And thirdly, the importance of the region in the study of global meteorology. Over the last 2 decades, Arctic surface air temperature has increased more than double the global average. It's widely assumed that the Arctic will continue to warm more than the global surface temperature, which will almost certainly further amplify the loss of Arctic sea ice. The scientific community has even begun to predict that the Arctic Ocean will become practically sea ice free in late summer by the end of the 21st century. As the climate changes, the Arctic and the communities that live there are experiencing increasingly catastrophic effects. Ongoing loss of Arctic sea ice has both local and remote impacts on the climate system, influencing the local surface energy budget as well as large-scale ocean and atmospheric circulation patterns and ecosystems. Reduced Arctic sea ice has been observed to have a range of impacts, including greater ocean transit through the region, expanding fishing and tourism activities, increased options for oil, gas, and mineral exploration in the Arctic offshore and onshore areas, and diminished Arctic marine mammal populations and the human communities that rely on these mammals for nutritional, cultural, and economic reasons. I believe that the protected access to resources and access to the sea lanes for transit are vital national security interests for the United States in the Arctic. Specifically, the diminishment of Arctic ice and potentially increased maritime access open the door for a race for Arctic resources between the United States and Arctic Council members like Russia, or observers, importantly, like China. The Arctic has significant resources, as we all know, but I cannot underscore enough that we must not allow global competition to disrupt the already fragile ecosystem that exists in the Arctic. Instead, I believe we need to focus on three main areas to preserve prosperity and stability in the Arctic and continue our decades-long cooperation with our Nordic partners. One, we need a government-wide approach to the Arctic to make the Arctic a national priority. The United States needs to continue to strengthen its presence in the Arctic, both militarily and civilian. And we need the appropriate infrastructure in the Arctic to support that presence. Two, Arctic nations must deal with the consequences of a changing climate and the patterns that are developing. We have a number of areas that are vulnerable to a rising sea level, and we need to make investments now to address these long-term consequences. Third, preservation of indigenous communities and the ecologies of the Arctic must be a top priority for the United States and other Arctic nations. To elaborate on the many issues facing the Arctic and to offer their unique perspective, we've invited 4 expert witnesses to explain the national security, environmental, and societal impacts that global warming poses to the Arctic. I welcome and thank Admiral Paul Zumkoff, former Commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard, Dr. Susan Natali of the Woodwall Climate Research Center, a veterinary research institution in the congressional district that I represent, Dr. Daly Sambo Duro of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, and Mr. Luke Coffey from the Heritage Foundation for being here today. That's a lot of witnesses, but we're going to cover a lot of subject matter here. This is the first House Foreign Affairs Committee hearing on the Arctic in this conference, and I believe each witness's testimony is essential to better understand the climate, the people, the geostrategic interests of the region. With that, I welcome an honest assessment where we need to go in our pursuit of a comprehensive Arctic strategy from our expert witnesses. And I want to thank them for being here, realizing that some of them are working out of a different time zone. And it was a little more personally difficult in that regard. So I'd like to recognize the ranking member now, Mr. Fitzpatrick, for his opening statement.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairman Keating, and thank you to all of our esteemed witnesses as we examine national security threats in the Arctic. And as one of the 8 countries located within the Arctic Circle, the United States has the opportunity to lead in a global effort towards multilateral cooperation in this quickly changing environment. And fortunately, we can do so in conjunction with our NATO partners in the region and through critical forums like the Arctic Council. The Arctic environment is undeniably changing. Ice is melting and waterways are becoming more navigable for longer periods of time each year. This increased accessibility also brings the potential for conflict to emerge in this traditionally peaceful region. And as such, the United States and our partners in the Arctic must insist on the integrity of our sovereignty. Clear expectations and proactive engagement in the region can allow for lowering of political temperatures and reduce the likelihood for future armed conflicts. Russia in particular, which maintains half of the world's Arctic territory within its borders, seems increasingly likely to test the limits of the United States and our allies in the Arctic. Authoritarians in the Kremlin have already shattered international norms through hostile and illegal occupation of nations like Ukraine and by weaponizing energy resources. And Russia's recent attempts to restrict access to the Northern Sea Route and their reinforcement of previously abandoned military installations are cause for concern and deliberate attention of the Biden administration. We must take steps to ensure that we are fully prepared should this aggression escalate in the Arctic. Moreover, as the current administration turns back and allows Nord Stream 2 pipeline's completion, we must be under no illusion that Russia will take environmental precautions as it prospects unexploited oil and gas reserves in the Arctic. And given the importance of this region, I urge my colleagues to support investment in U.S. interests and assets in the Arctic by increasing our diplomatic security presence. And the opening of the U.S. consulate in Nuuk, Greenland, was a positive step for invigorated U.S. engagement in the region, but it cannot end there. Our Coast Guard installations, such as Barrow in Alaska, should warrant increased backing as well. And growing Arctic traffic will require expanded, specialized search and rescue operations to face the brutal conditions of the high north. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, the United States must remain committed to bolstering military and scientific capabilities in the Arctic as the region takes greater focus on the world stage. And environmental changes and advancements in technology will require modernizing aspects of our national security operations to stay competitive. And it is my hope that my colleagues can come together to support this goal. Again, thanks to the panelists for being here with us. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the ranking member for his opening remarks. And I'd like to now call on our witnesses for their opening statements. First, I'll introduce Admiral Paul F. Zumkov, who has served as the 25th Commandant of the United States Coast Guard from 2014 to 2018, coming from my district, a coastal district. Admiral, I can't tell you my great esteem and appreciation for the Coast Guard and their daily work. Welcome, and now I recognize you for 5 minutes for opening statement.
Chair Keating, thank you for those kind remarks, and Ranking Member Fitzpatrick and members of the subcommittee. I'm truly honored to testify at today's hearing on a topic that has had and continues to have my laser focus, and that is the Arctic. Before I deliver my oral testimony, I request that my written testimony be entered into the record.
Action. So moved, so done. And I will say this just to preempt the other witnesses. I'll now make a motion that all their written testimonies be submitted for the record. Any objection? Hearing none. All your written testimonies will be moved for the record. You may continue, Alan.
Okay, thank you, Chair. The United States has been an Arctic nation for the past 154 years after Secretary of State William Seward brokered the purchase of the Alaska Territory from a then cash-strapped Russia at a cost of $7.2 million in then dollars, or roughly 2 cents per acre. It was then dubbed Seward's Folly, but it has proved to be strategic foresight, and not simply due to the vast natural resources in our 49th state, but for had it not been for such a folly, the Russian Republic and its military arsenal would currently occupy this region, and the U.S. would at best be a near Arctic nation. So we have strategic foresight dating back to 1867 and what I will call strategic afterthought as it pertains to the Arctic over the past several decades. We have a presidential policy directive, strategy, and memorandum released by the 3 previous administrations, respectively. But each of those were released at the trailing edge of those administrations and failed to carry the full weight from one administration to the next. And I will come back to that in my closing. Over the past half century, as the chair has mentioned, the Arctic has warmed at nearly twice the rate than the rest of the planet. I witnessed this firsthand when in 2017, I visited the Jakobshavn Glacier in Greenland that is moving at an accelerated pace into the North Atlantic Ocean. When I asked the Inuit elders in Ilulissat what I was witnessing, their response in 2 words was climate change. Just as profound, sea ice is in retreat across the Arctic Ocean, and great power competition is rapidly filling that void, particularly Russia. Russia operates a fleet of icebreakers that is 9 times that of the United States yet it has a GDP that is nearly 1/10 of that of the United States. Natural islands are being militarized. Ice-breaking corvettes with a cruise missile package that can range the northern tier of the United States and beyond are being delivered, and its extraterritorial claims extend up to the North Pole. And then there's the Northern Sea Route, an international strait under the Law of the Sea Convention that connects the Asian and European markets while trimming 1/3 of the transit time by bypassing the Suez Canal for commercial shipping during the ice-free season. But Russia not only treats the Northern Sea Route as its internal waters, but has imposed draconian measures for any vessel, to include military ships and, yes, US ships, to request permission to enter and procure the services of a Russian icebreaker and ship pilot before transiting the Northern Sea Route. Meanwhile, China deems itself a near Arctic nation, although its northernmost extreme is some 900 miles south of the Arctic Circle. China has invested heavily in Russia's LNG facility on the Yamal Peninsula and in the economies of Greenland and Iceland. China gained observer status on the Arctic Council in 2013 and recently delivered its second icebreaker with aspirations of launching a nuclear icebreaker to advance its Belt and Road Initiative in the Arctic. While I am pleased to see the U.S. Coast Guard has full funding for 2 heavy polar security cutters, it is clearly 2 decades behind in the acquisition and delivery schedule. I must emphasize that the Coast Guard's program of record requires 3 heavy, 3 medium polar security cutters. Our nation's only heavy icebreaker, Polar Star, has been in service for over 45 years now, while serving in the harshest environments on the face of the planet. The U.S. lacks a deep-water port in the Arctic that compromises sustained at-sea operations in that domain, while bandwidth and maritime domain awareness above 70 degrees north are woefully inadequate. While I served as Commandant of the Coast Guard, I was fortunate to establish an Arctic Coast Guard Forum in 2016, comprised of the Coast Guards from the 8-member Arctic Council nations that have been conducting combined exercises in the Arctic ever since. And where the U.S. lacks strength in numbers in the Arctic, there is strength in our alliances. 5 of the 8 Arctic Council nations are members of Nato, while Finland and Sweden are key contributors to NATO-led operations. Collectively, our alliances have an aggregate fleet of 35 icebreakers, to include Norway's Svalbard-class icebreaking patrol vessels, to reduce the numbers gap with Russia. I close by stating that this administration has an opportunity to synthesize the Arctic initiatives of the 3 previous administrations, where there is a commonality across all 3 of those administrations, so that this Arctic roadmap can gain momentum now. The reactivation of the Arctic Executive Steering Committee this past September is clearly a step in the right direction. Finally, on the matter of maritime governance, the U.S. is not positioned to govern diplomatically in this realm until such time it ratifies the Law of the Sea Convention. Chair, I thank you for this opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your insights and questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Admiral, and thank you for that sobering testimony, and look forward to some questions. Second witness I'd like to introduce is Dr. Susan M. Natale. She's the Arctic Program Director at the Woodwall Climate Research Center in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. And it's interesting, just a few miles from where I live. It's interesting, too, that it wasn't too long ago that we saw the Armstrong, the ice-breaking vessel, NSI, as an asset set launch through there. And they're dealing directly on land with Woods Hole. So I look forward to your testimony. Now recognize Dr. Susan Natale.
All right, great. Can you hear me now? Okay, and thank you so much. I'm going to share some slides. We can get this to work to give members of the committee who haven't been to the Arctic an idea of what some of the changes that are happening look like. So can you see those slides now?
Yes.
Okay. Great. Okay, so thank you to the committee, in particular Representative Keating, for inviting me to provide testimony to this hearing. I'm very honored to be here. I'm Dr. Sue Natale. I'm the Arctic Program Director and a senior scientist at the Woodwall Climate Research Center. I'm an Arctic ecologist, and I study the effects of permafrost thaw and northern wildfires on Arctic lands and the global climate. So Woodwall Climate Research Center is a nonprofit organization. We're based in Falmouth, Massachusetts, made up of researchers who work with partners worldwide to understand and combat climate change. So while the world has already warmed 1.1 degrees Celsius on average above pre-industrial levels, the Arctic is warming more than 2 times faster than this global average. In the coming years, Arctic temperatures are projected to continue to rise at an accelerated rate, further exacerbating climate hazards, including wildfires, sea ice melt, coastal erosion, and permafrost thaw. Okay, so permafrost is ground that has been frozen for 2 or more consecutive years. It's also been frozen for many hundreds to thousands of years. Permafrost underlies about 15% of the Northern Hemisphere land area and approximately 85% of Alaska's land area. From a global climate change perspective, permafrost thaw is critically important because the permafrost region stores a vast amount of carbon. There's roughly twice as much carbon stored in permafrost as is currently contained in the entire Earth's atmosphere. Once thawed, this previously frozen carbon can be broken down by microbes and released into the atmosphere as greenhouse gases, methane and carbon dioxide. The release of greenhouse gases from thawing permafrost can accelerate climate warming, leading to additional thaw. As stated in the International Panel on Climate Change recently released 6th assessment report, the loss of permafrost carbon is irreversible on a human-relevant timeframe. The report projected that between 3 and 41 billion tons of carbon dioxide will be released by thawing permafrost per each 1 degree Celsius of warming by 2100. However, this range likely underestimates the potential of permafrost carbon emissions because currently no global models include some important thaw processes, such as thaw-induced ground collapse. When accounting for the full scope of thaw processes, cumulative permafrost carbon emissions by the end of the century could be on par with continued emissions from a country like Japan, or as high as continued emissions from the United States. As a result, permafrost thaw emissions could take up between 25 and 40% of the remaining carbon budget to stay below 2 degrees Celsius. This means that we need to be cutting fossil fuel emissions even faster than is currently understood. The local and regional implications of permafrost thaw are also widespread and significant. Permafrost thaw can cause the ground to sink, a phenomenon known as subsidence. And when there's a large amount of ice in the permafrost, as seen here, the ground can abruptly collapse, which creates hazardous conditions for Arctic residents and contributes to the rising costs of climate change. These hazards are already being experienced across Alaska, endangering human health, destroying public infrastructure, threatening water, cultural resources, traditional food storage and ways of living, and access to subsistence resources. Additionally, foundations of military infrastructure in the Arctic are already cracking and becoming increasingly unstable due to ground thaw. The risk and severity of climate impacts are particularly high for coastal communities in Alaska, where loss of land-fast sea ice is increasing storm impacts, and permafrost thaw is exacerbating coastal erosion rates. Almost a decade ago, the U.S. Government Accountability Office identified 31 Alaskan villages that face imminent threat from flooding, erosion, and permafrost thaw. At the time of the report, 12 villages were seeking relocation options. However, none of these villages have yet fully relocated, in large part because of a lack of a governance framework to facilitate relocation efforts. We're working with our partners in some of these communities to monitor the catastrophic and combined effects of permafrost thaw, flooding, and erosion, known as USTEC, to support climate adaptation planning. Permafrost thaw is already occurring in Alaska and across the Arctic. Domestically, we need to act now to ensure that communities in Alaska and federal agencies are prepared for these impacts and put into place aggressive mitigation and adaptation policies to respond to these changes and to prevent further avoidable climate warming. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor. And I appreciate that. I'll have some questions for you as we go forward. Dr. Daly Sambo Duro is the chairperson of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, fresh back from COP26 in Glasgow, where I also attended. Welcome back and thank you for joining us. I now recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Representative Keating, and also thanks to the Commandant and also Dr. Natali for the comments that they've provided thus far. Very quickly, I just want to precede my written testimony with a couple of comments that security from our perspective means something much more than national security. It is really the state of being free from danger or threat. But as you've already heard, we're facing dangers and threats presently to our cultural security, our environmental security, our economic security, our food security, or essentially our overall security. It's not lost on any observer that Arctic matters have emerged in the way of high politics, and therefore it's crucial for the international norms, rules, and responsibilities that have emerged by nation states, that these remain at the core of our understanding of Arctic relations. So again, I'm very pleased to make some comments on behalf of the Inuit Circumpolar Council. We represent approximately 180,000 Inuit across Inuit Nunat, our traditional territories. And our traditional territories cover nearly half of the Arctic region throughout Chukotka, Alaska, Canada, and Greenland. The Arctic is our homeland. Over thousands of years, we've nurtured reciprocal, symbiotic, and respectful relationships between our peoples and the Arctic environment, and we have transferred our knowledge through countless generations. Our cultural identities, values, spirituality, livelihoods, and overall mental and physical wellness are tied to our total environment, of which we are an intimate part. Climate change is a primary concern. Its multiple impacts are adversely affecting our societies, threatening our overall cultural integrity, from threats to our food security and food systems, to relocation and displacement, to adverse impacts on our health and well-being, to the biodiversity of our ecosystems, essentially our entire way of life. Climate change is damaging and disrupting the natural elements of our lands and territories, including our marine environment. Climate change impacts are also compounded by state-imposed laws and regulations that hinder our rights and access to resources and exacerbate issues such as atmospheric pollution, substandard and unreliable infrastructure, increased vessel traffic and shipping, industrialized fishing, unsustainable development, and energy solutions that have been framed as green, all of which are driven by others far from our homelands and without our consent. Yet we remain optimistic because we ourselves have solutions. We are prepared to contribute. We simply demand respect for and recognition of our distinct status, rights, and role, as well as our own governance structures, including our right to maintain, own, and control our knowledge systems to effectively contribute to research and the co-production of knowledge. Upon this foundation, we can provide Indigenous knowledge that will ensure that you, as policy and decision makers, have the best available information to base your decisions upon. Regarding the subject matter of this hearing, our overall collective security is threatened. Our security includes diverse elements from the Arctic Ocean, its coastal seas, and the cryosphere, which are critical ecosystems that must be protected through partnership with Inuit. And our future security depends upon our distinct involvement in all matters concerning the dynamic relationship that we have with our homelands. We were organized in the midst of the Cold War to adopt Bernard Barrack's use of the term in 1947. Barrack's original interest is aligned with our hope that the world can renew itself physically or spiritually. As far back as 1977, we addressed Arctic security by adopting a resolution specific to the peaceful use of the Arctic. These actions are reflected in the ICC Arctic policy, as well as a 1983 resolution, and more recently within the 2018 Utqiagvik Declaration, adopted at our last General Assembly in Utqiagvik. The latter directs ICC leadership to lay the foundation for diplomatic dialogue on the establishment of an Arctic zone of peace. Indeed, the UN mechanism that crafted the Antarctic Treaty, the Seabed Treaty, and other nuclear weapon-free zones has been explored by the ICC. We urge all Arctic states, including the US, to consider this constructive mechanism. Furthermore, we have adopted the Circumpolar Inuit Declaration on Arctic Sovereignty, which underscores internationally affirmed human rights standards, including the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It also calls for close cooperation among Arctic states and Inuit on all matters of Arctic sovereignty. Significantly, the ICC chose to launch this declaration at the Foreign Ministers gathering that coincided with the Melting Ice Conference in April 2009. In conclusion, we view these matters as interrelated. We respectfully request that the U.S. adopt the same perspective and specifically seriously consider how climate change is impacting Inuit. We ask that you ensure that Inuit have the financial means to address adaptation and mitigation on our own terms, as well as the intellectual and political space to make substantive contributions in favor of ourselves and the United States. Our direct participation should be afforded in relation to every issue that impacts Inuit lands, territories, and resources, from national security to so-called green energy solutions, to priorities for development, to safeguarding the marine environment, and ultimately our pathway toward ensuring our own cultural integrity, our own cultural security. We are an essential force in all of these questions. In my estimation, we are the central bastion of protection of the Arctic, and we urge the whole of the U.S. government to recognize the substantive contributions that we are willing to make. Rihanna, thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor, and thank you for all your work in this regard. Next witness is Mr. Luke Coffey. He's the director of the Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation. You're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Keating, Ranking Member Fitzpatrick, and distinguished members of the committee. I am honored to speak before this esteemed committee today about Arctic security issues. As was already pointed out, the U.S. became an Arctic power on October 18, 1867, and with a stroke of a pen, the then Secretary of State William Seward ended Russian influence in North America and gave the United States direct access to the Northern Pacific and Arctic Oceans. In his retirement, Seward was asked what his greatest achievement was, and he said, "The purchase of Alaska. It'll take another generation to find it out." Melting ice has led to an increase in scientific, commercial, tourist, and energy exploration activity in the region. This in itself has led to a growing military presence in the Arctic, but not because there's a threat of war, but because many of the capabilities needed in the region, such as search and rescue, are more immediately, and at least for now, more effectively provided by militaries and coast guards. Mr. Chairman, today the U.S. has 4 primary security interests in the Arctic when it comes to national security. Firstly, ensuring the territorial defense of the United States. In this sense, Canada, our northern neighbor, is vital. Relations with Iceland and Greenland are also important in this context. Secondly, enforcing U.S. sovereignty in the region. In the Arctic, sovereignty equals security and stability. Respecting the sovereignty of others while maintaining the ability to enforce one's own sovereignty ensures that the chances of armed conflict in the region remain low. Thirdly, meeting treaty obligations in the Arctic through NATO. 5 of the world's 8 Arctic countries belong to NATO, but the alliance has no agreed policy on the region. Finally, ensuring the free flow of shipping and other economic activities in the region. Mr. Chairman, while the military threat in the Arctic remains low, U.S. policymakers cannot ignore Russia or China's role there. Both directly impact America's ability to meet its security interests. Russia's recent actions to bolster its military presence in the Arctic is concerning. Russia now has at least 34 military installations in or near the Arctic. It is optimizing those facilities for cold weather warfare, and it has expanded the variety and sophistication of the capabilities deployed to the region. And it is also increasing the range and tempo of the often very aggressive nature of its air and sea patrols in the Arctic region. There's also an economic aspect of Russia's activities in the Arctic. The Northern Sea Route, which runs along Russia's northern coast connecting European with Asian markets, is often touted as a possible alternative and even a rival to the Suez Canal. However, some perspective is needed. Last year, only 32 million tons of goods were shipped along the route, compared to the 1.2 billion tons that transited the Suez Canal. Of the 32 million tons of goods that shipped along the route, only 1.2 million tons made the full journey between Europe and Asia. So this is 1/10 of 1% of the total volume shipped through the Suez Canal last year. And this route is not without risk. Shipping lanes are far removed from search and rescue facilities. Oil and gas make up about 82% of the volume of goods shipped along the Northern Sea routes, increasing the odds of an ecological disaster in the region. And there are currently about 20 vessels as we speak here, as we meet here today, that are either stuck or they're struggling to make it across the icy waters. In simplest terms, China sees the Arctic region as another place in the world to advance its economic interests. But considering the problems that China has created in other places around the world, there are reasons to be worried by their activities in the Arctic. Beijing's Arctic strategy offers a useful glimpse of how it wants the rest of the world to see the role of China in the Arctic region. Running 5,500 words long in the English language version, the strategy is littered with all the popular Arctic buzz phrases, such as common interests of all countries, law-based governance, climate change, and sustainable development. Now, the irony is not lost on observers of the South China Sea, where China has shunned international norms to exert dubious claims of sovereignty, or by the fact that China is the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases. Even though China's closest point to the Arctic Circle is more than 800 nautical miles away, Beijing refers to itself as a near Arctic state, which is a term that is completely made up. Extending Beijing's logic to other countries would mean that Kazakhstan, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, Germany, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and Ireland are also near Arctic states. In conclusion, I want to highlight some of the actions that we should take. We need to increase our freedom of navigation operations in the Arctic. We need to adequately invest in the U.S. Coast Guard and U.S. Navy's Arctic capabilities. We need to continue to raise awareness of China's questionable ambitions in the region and make sure that China does not try exceeding what it is allowed to do under its status as an observer in the Arctic Council. We need to get NATO to finally acknowledge its role in the Arctic and perhaps even hold a future NATO summit above the Arctic Circle. And finally, we need to increase America's diplomatic, economic, military, and scientific presence in Greenland, Iceland, Svalbard, and Jan Mayen. These 4 islands are essentially the forward operating bases of the North American continent and serve as what I like to call the Arctic chain of defense for the United States. Now, none of these actions are about preparing for war. They are simply about preparing for the future. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the committee. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Coffey. I think we hear from the 4 witnesses when we're talking about our nation's security in this region, we have to look at it through the lens of their testimony. Certainly, the scientific community is part of our security there. It's necessary to understand what's going on. The understanding and input from the indigenous population is important for our success. The navigational, economic, and military aspects, it's all intertwined. So thank you for your testimony. I'll now recognize members for 5 minutes each. And pursuant to the House rules, all time yielded is for the purposes of questioning the witnesses. Because of the virtual format of the hearing, I'll recognize members by committee seniority, alternating between Democrats and Republicans. If you miss your turn, please let our staff know and we'll circle back to you. If you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphone and address the chair verbally. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I think I'll start with Admiral Zucco, because you laid out very clearly the strategic afterthought posture that the U.S. has had. And one of the reasons for having this hearing early in this administration is to try and see if we can accelerate the interest and involvement in the Arctic area on all the fronts we've discussed, because that's something that's critical to our economic and security interests. Now, a national intelligence estimate by the National Intelligence Council on climate change and international responses that show the increasing challenges to U.S. national security was released just in October of 21. And it states the Arctic and the non-Arctic states almost certainly will increase their competitions in the area by 2040. And it says it's largely economic, but the risk of miscalculation, even modestly, could be great. So, Admiral, I'd like to, you laid out the situation. Can you spend some more and give us more insight, some more time and give us more insight on the risk of miscalculating just how these involvements impact our security in all the ways we mentioned?
Thank you, Chair. And I would just categorize that our presence in the Arctic is late to the game. Russia has de facto established itself as a regional hegemon. And we're hearing the same rhetoric coming out of Moscow as well, almost thumbing their nose at any effort we make. To its credit, and to follow up on the testimony by Mr. Coffey, there was a large NATO exercise on the Greenland, Iceland side of the Arctic in 2019. We're waking up, but we're a little bit late to that wake-up call. We clearly, the United States cannot influence this region unilaterally. We've got to do so through our trusted partners. At the same time, we can't treat everything as an adversary in the Arctic. Economically is going to be a key driver in this region. And bad things can happen, search and rescue, which is why I established an Arctic Coast Guard forum. We have the Arctic Council that puts out binding agreements, but no teeth behind it. So the Coast Guards are filling that vacuum to address marine environmental protection, indigenous tribes, and as well as search and rescue in the region. So at least it builds some trust and confidence building measures, especially when we add Russia to that mix. But we need to invest in this region, which is why we need a strategy at the onset and a strategy that isn't just a skeleton, but we can put flesh on those bones as well.
Good, thank you. I just wanted to jump into an issue that was a curiosity to me. In Russia, those massive fires that occurred in Siberia and through the areas, the magnitude is unbelievable. I'd like to, ask our panel, particularly probably Dr. Natali, how much do we know, how much scientific research into the magnitude of the permafrost effect there and those fires, how much have we been able to analyze given so much of it occurred in Russia?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So we can get information using satellites on fire extent and also emissions. And we also do have scientific collaborations with many Russian scientists. So there's certainly one of the challenges of doing scientific research in the Arctic is that it comprises multiple nations, and data sharing is certainly a challenge. But there's also lots of uncertainties because when we think about, changes in Arctic lands, permafrost is below the ground. You cannot often see that with satellites unless there's some pretty substantial ground collapse. And by that point, the impacts have already happened. And also greenhouse gas emissions from the Arctic. We don't have the capacity satellites to view this across the Arctic via satellites. And so the Arctic is a pretty vast place. It's not accessible.
Could you share with us too the magnitude of this? I think it's something that escaped a lot of people's attention, but the magnitude of those fires in Russia.
Yeah, I mean, those fires, there were in the United States, there's lots of conversations about fires that are burning out west, and this is orders of magnitude higher emissions that are happening in these fires in Russia. And the reason that there's so much carbon greenhouse gases coming out of these fires, not just the area of the fires, is because when in the Arctic, because there's so much carbon below ground, it doesn't just burn the vegetation and the trees above ground, it actually burns the soil. And one of the things that's happening in the Arctic, because the ground isn't refreezing, these fires are continuing to last through the winter. So you're having fires from one year are causing more fires in the following year because they can smolder below ground, just slowly burning this carbon that's below the soils. And honestly, when we think about the carbon emissions that are coming as a result of permafrost, as a result of these wildfires, and what we can expect in the future, I would say the scientific numbers were, I would say, very likely underestimating. So when thinking about risk, personally, I would lead towards the high end of some of these ranges because these processes currently are not incorporated into our models, into our full scientific understanding.
Great, thank you so much. My time has expired for now. Chair recognizes Congressman Mast for 5 minutes. Congressman Mast, he was here a second ago. Chair recognizes Congressman Pfluger for 5 minutes.
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for your contributions to this. I'd like to start off with Mr. Coffey talking about some of the resources that we see in the Arctic and some of the geopolitical challenges that we face right now with regards to control of Eastern Europe. And you can start in the Baltics and run all the way down through the countries that border Russia, and you can go all the way into the Balkans and see the number of countries that are in some ways being held hostage to energy that is produced by Russia, and to the terms and conditions with which you have to sign up to use that energy. So, Mr. Coffey, can you kind of talk to us a little bit about the resources that are in the Arctic, and how those can be used to diversify energy security for our European partners and allies, and how that may also contribute to stabilizing what we know as a competition, and maybe that's a generous word, but with Russia. So I'll yield to you for a second.
Thank you. That's a very important question. The reality is that although the region is rich in natural resources, accessing these resources in a financially viable or environmentally safe way is very difficult. And in the case of one limiting factor is the advancement in technology to extract these resources in an economically viable and environmentally safe way has not kept pace. In terms of the alternatives that might be provided to Europe for alternatives to energy security coming from Russia, I would actually say that the Arctic is less important than, let's say, other regions of the Eurasian landmass, such as the Caspian region, the South Caucasus, where I think there's a lot of potential for Europe to seek alternatives to its oil and gas away from Russia. But that being said, there are suspected to be a large number of rare earth mineral deposits in the Arctic region. We heard about this debate when President Trump suggested the United States purchases Greenland, about the potential in Greenland for these resources. But take Greenland, for example. It's a very remote part of the world. No two cities in Greenland are connected by a road, so there's very little infrastructure. And right now, most of Greenland is covered by an ice cap that is 3 times the size of Texas, and at its deepest point is almost 2 miles thick. So
can I
it's not
ask
possible to really get these minerals.
let me ask a quick question here as time is going to run out on us. I mean, how bad of a situation energy wise is Europe in right now for this coming winter? I mean, kind of put some magnitude by it as to what our partners and allies in Europe, as this is the Europe Committee and the Energy Committee, tell us about the energy crisis they're facing and how bad it's going to be.
Yeah, Europe is facing a major energy crisis, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, where Russia once again uses the export of LNG or of natural gas, excuse me, as a tool of foreign policy and a tool of aggression. This can be mitigated in the medium to longer term by focusing more on the Southern Gas Corridor, pushing for a Trans-Caspian gas pipeline connecting Turkmenistan across the Caspian to the Southern Gas Corridor, and pushing for more U.S. LNG exports to Europe. But I appreciate that this isn't the specific nature of the hearing today, but it's still all connected in a sense, because as Europe wants to minimize or reduce its greenhouse emissions, natural gas, of course, is considered a transition fuel. And if they're having difficulty paying the high prices for the transition fuel, then this could slow down Europe's ability to meet carbon emission reduction targets in the coming years.
Well, I think it is absolutely connected, and I appreciate you making that point, because what we're doing by not allowing our partners and allies to use the cleanest burning LNG in the world, the cleanest burning natural gas in the world, which comes from the United States, is then pushing it to China and Russia, who will fill the void. And so any concerns that we have regarding our Earth, our climate in the future, need to take into account the fact that those two people, China and Russia, were not at the summit. They didn't participate and they don't care. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, the chair recognizes the vice chair of the committee, Congresswoman Spanberger, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Keating. I appreciate everyone's willingness and comments here before the subcommittee on this particularly important topic. Admiral Zumkunft, I would love to begin with you. First, thank you for your service. But I'd like to focus my questions on Russia's role and interest in shaping the future of the Arctic. Mr. Coffey just spoke about the scope and size of ice in the Arctic. And so my question is really focused on, as that ice melts, the Russian military is really becoming more engaged in the high north, rebuilding military infrastructure along the coast, requiring military escorts for commercial vessels along the coast, and really reposturing their forces in the region. So could you, based on your experience, can you describe the extent of Russia's military modernization in the Arctic? And what risks do you think are created by the posture that they are taking on? And also, as a follow-on to that, how do you believe the United States should look at their actions and prepare and potentially react?
A great question, Congresswoman. I'll be glad to address those. So we've seen this movie before in the East-South China Sea. And Russia has taken a chapter, and maybe they wrote the book on this. When we start looking at the militarization of natural islands, not man-made, that have the ability to deny access to any military activity, but particularly that of the United States. When Russia is launching ice-breaking corvettes that can carry a cruise missile that can range, and now we have very short windows of time of notification for NORTHCOM NORAD to have awareness that we now have an inbound conventional strike being launched from the Arctic by one of these ships. What's up with that? And so what we don't have is, confidence in terms of Russia's way ahead, claiming all the way up to the North Pole as its expanded continental shelf. 350 miles, is the limit under the law of the Sea Convention, which Russia has thumbed its nose at. The same thing with the Northern Sea Route. Not today, but as we listen to Dr. Natale's brief, and we look at CO2 methane releases, as we get more carbon dioxide, which, by the way, takes about a century to metabolize from the atmosphere. That drives temperature, which drives sea level rise. So is Russia looking at the long game? That not today, but at some point in the near future, that the Northern Sea Route will become a viable corridor for the Asia-European markets, primarily to move LNG from the Yamal Peninsula. Huge economic driver, but that is also what drives Russia's economy, which they use to leverage and influence other nations as well. So all of this, it cuts across a full spectrum of diplomatic, law of the sea convention, governance, our lack of awareness, which is information, because we haven't invested in that infrastructure, the militarization of the Arctic, and economically. Russia is playing this on all four fronts.
Admiral, when you say the lack of information because we haven't invested there, could you explain a little bit more what you mean by that?
Yeah, so we send our icebreakers up there, and once they get much above 72 degrees north, our investment in satellite infrastructure is now on the horizon or nearly below it. So we don't have adequate space-based technology to improve awareness and, more importantly, to improve our bandwidth to move data. So that remains a challenge in the high latitudes for us right now.
And is that a lack of prioritization from your perspective or from your experience? A lack of real understanding of the potential threat? What would you attribute that to? I mean, certainly funding, I'm sure.
Yeah, and from my opening statement, we have great directives under 3 presidential administrations that underscore this. But it came out time late in those administrations. As we say, we have a strategic skeleton, but we haven't put any flesh on the bone. And those tend to not carry forward from one regime to the next. So we have that opportunity right now. Maybe COP26 is that catalyst to say, hey, we need to double down on our effort here in the Arctic. I hope we do.
Well, and I see Dr. Doro shaking her head as well. In the remaining 30 seconds that we have left, putting the meat on the bones, if you could give us just a couple things that would put the meat on the bones in terms of our ability to really understand and track this threat, what would you recommend we as Congress advocate for?
A deep water port in the Arctic, increased bandwidth for communications, and that also affects communications for our indigenous residents as well. Investing in exerting U.S. sovereignty, which means icebreakers. And icebreakers mean they can also carry militarized equipment as well. So using the Norway-Russia model, and by the way, Canada is making those investments as well. Leveraging our partners, especially with our partners to the north. And finally, ratifying the Law of the Sea Convention.
Okay. Thank you very much, Admiral Zunkow, and Chairman Keating. Thank you for your indulgence in letting me go over. And thank you to our
Thank you
witnesses.
so much. As a matter of fact, if Dr. Doro could do this quickly, you had attempted to answer that as well. Could you do that in 30 seconds? Is that possible?
Yes, I think so. It's fairly clear, and I think the Commandant and others have said this, that infrastructure is one of the key elements here. It's a key element for research. It's a key element in terms of energy. It's a key element in terms of security, as well as a key element for the impacts of climate change upon our communities. And I think this shouldn't be underestimated. And the Commandant is right. We are late to the wake-up call as far as the United States is concerned. Our communities are already facing and living with substandard infrastructure. The final comment I want to make is the reference to the norms, the rules, and responsibilities under public international law. In terms of UNCLOS in particular, I think there are a whole host of issues that we have to be mindful of, especially against the backdrop of Russia's activity and the interests of China. These two are constantly scanning the globe for their energy security, their food security, their national security. What about our security?
Thank you. Chair recognizes Congressman Peter Meyer for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our speakers who are here today on this important issue. I had the opportunity to visit Franz Josef Land and Svalbard on the Arctic Circle a couple of decades ago, and it was clear then that we had not a significant American military interest or presence, and just how far that needle has shifted with the icebreaker gap that we have. That especially Admiral, you've spoken to, and Mr. Coffey as well, has been very clear. And the recent, relatively recent, but ramping up of use of Novaya Zemlya by the Russians for missile testing, shows that they are taking advantage of the fact that we have, cast our eye to, granted, incredibly important parts of the world, whether it's Asia Pacific or the CENTCOM AOR. At the same time, we can't afford to ignore what's going on. So I appreciate that we're A, having this hearing, but B, that there's been a commitment across administrations in order to try to address that icebreaker capability gap. I'm going to go to Mr. Coffey in a second. But Admiral, in your view, is there anything that we in Congress can be doing to try to expedite? Obviously, for the past, this administration, the past two administrations have also affirmed, our commitment to engaging in the Arctic. Is there anything left in Congress's court, or is this going to be flowing through executive policy and procurements on the DoD side and Coast Guard side that have already started to progress?
Yeah. Thank you, Congressman. And I'll talk, first of all, what we need to do domestically. And as we look at who was there, who was not there at COP26, we really need to double down our efforts, or what are we doing to adapt to a changing climate? As we heard from Dr. Monroe, we have 31 villages. I was out in Sheshmarif, which is literally washing into the sea. That is one of the 12 villages that's looking to relocate. Army Corps of Engineers sunk some money in there to build revetment. But first and foremost, we need to do the humanitarian thing for our First Nations that reside in the Arctic region. And the second is, we need to step up and be a global leader in this domain as well. I stepped up as Commandant of the Coast Guard because our military, I sit with the Joint Chiefs, are focused on, at that time, was Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and violent extremism. There was nothing left on the plate to make room for the Arctic. It says, okay, I'll take the Arctic. We now have a defense strategy that came out in 2019 that now includes the Arctic as well. So, we're making policy statements, we're writing strategies, but now it's time for us to, peel those back another layer. And then where do we need to make smart investments? The immediate one is we need to adapt to a climate change, and two, we need to invest in our ability to exert sovereignty in this region.
Thank you, Admiral. And Mr. Coffey, I think this is the first time I've heard in a committee hearing in quite a while, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on what the benefits of the U.S. Being formally a signatory to UNCLOS, the drawbacks, and just where we go from here. I mean, both in the Arctic and freedom of navigation operations with Russia expanding its continental shelf definition and dropping little flags ever further away from what I think anyone would rationally call its territorial water. What we're seeing in China with many dashed plans in order to again just assert that control. Is it worth revisiting UNCLOS, or should we focus on other methods in order of asserting a global standard around navigation operations?
Well, in terms of the enforcement of global norms and laws when it comes to maritime operations, the U.S. Navy for many decades has set the standard on what is the norm in terms of maritime law. And also, in addition, many of the maritime boundary disputes that the United States had, we only have two maritime boundaries in the Arctic, one with Canada, one with Russia. So the one with Russia is a settled matter. The one with Canada is being worked out bilaterally. So in those two cases, the international norms and the boundary disputes, I do not see how U.S. ratification of the Law of the Sea Treaty would directly benefit the United States. And then on balance, you have this issue of encroachment on sovereignty, especially when it comes to the extraction of deep seabed minerals and the mechanism that is involved in sharing certain profits from the extraction of these minerals with landlocked countries around the world. There are many good questions that need to be answered about how this might impact the United States going forward, when we have no idea how many potentially trillions of dollars could be generated from this process and how much the United States and the U.S. taxpayer would be forced to share.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, with that, my time's expired, but I hope someone can talk a little bit more about those manganese nodules that are sitting on that seabed. Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you, Representative. Chair now recognizes Representative Susan Wild for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to direct this question to the Admiral. Admiral, last month, the National Intelligence Council released an intelligence estimate on climate change and the challenges the climate crisis and responses to it posed to our national security. And it says, the intelligence report says, contested economic and military activities will increase the risk of miscalculation, and de-escalating tensions is likely to require the adaptation of existing or creation of new forums to address bilateral or multilateral security concerns among Arctic states. At the same time as we continue actively working to protect our security and economic interests in the Arctic, could you discuss what you view as the most effective pathways for long-term de-escalation of tensions?
Thank you, Congressman. I'll first address the de-escalation component of that. In 2016, and this is while the United States chaired the Arctic Council, I worked with the White House and with State Department and was granted approval to invite Russia to Washington, D.C., my counterpart from the Russia Border Guard, which then led to the creation of an Arctic Coast Guard Forum. My counterpart from Russia literally gave me a bear hug. Because their concern are posture statements. We have an adversarial relationship with Russia, but not an enemy. And there's a distinction between the two. And we need to find areas where we can cooperate with one another. We do so on a regular basis with Russia on the maritime boundary line. Our 17th Coast Guard District in Juneau in real time shares information with Russia on incursions, and likewise, they do the same with us as well. So there's an opportunity. And the other one is Nato. There was a significant Nato exercise that was conducted where the U.S. played a huge role in this. I'm talking 250 aircraft, over 70,000 troops doing an exercise in the Arctic, which is ice-free. We're talking in the North Atlantic, not in the Chukchi, Barents Sea, in the North Pacific side. But that sends a signal to Russia. It's like, hey, we're paying attention. And we've gone through some fits and starts with our relationship with our NATO partners, but we have an opportunity right now to, hey,
Well,
this is a focus area, and not just our NATO partners, but Finland and Sweden are significant players as well.
well, good. Then you rendered second part of that question moot, because I was going to ask you what does Russia's chairmanship of the Arctic Council mean for our interests in the Arctic, and whether it presents challenges, and could it also present any opportunities? But it sounds like you believe that the opportunities are there. Is that right?
It is, Congresswoman, and the fact that Ambassador David Bolton, who was our envoy early on in the Arctic Council, now the director of the Arctic Executive Steering Committee, we have good continuity in terms of strategic vision and direction at the highest levels in terms of our Arctic equities.
All right, great. Well, I'm going to move on to Dr. Duro and just ask, since I have a little more than a minute and a half left. In your testimony, Dr. Duro, you described the long-time aspiration for an Arctic zone of peace. Could you expand on this vision and explain how the ongoing threat of confrontation in the region threatens the way of life of indigenous communities?
Mhm. Yeah, as I said at the outset of my comments, we emerged in the midst of the Cold War, and we see that re-emerging through a host of different actions by much more powerful forces than ourselves. And everything that has been addressed thus far by all of the commentators here is that presently we have a level of cooperation and collaboration through the Arctic Council, through the Coast Guard Forum, through a host of different things. But in order to crystallize this region for purposes not only of ourselves, the designation of the region as a zone of peace, and I mean, the other examples and precedents are there, that this would then ensure that at a minimum, we can bring parties to the table, expand the table, if you will, especially when we look at the movements of the Russian Federation, we look at the movements of China, very few have mentioned, actually, it hasn't been mentioned, the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement and the desire to look at the viability of commercial or industrial fishing in this area. We have to find ways to stave these activities off. So a zone of peace may lend itself to a level of dialogue that we haven't experienced thus far. Indeed, the Arctic Council is a constructive mechanism. It has spawned important international treaties. Many of those objectives are, in my assessment, unmet in terms of search and rescue, in terms of research and cooperation. But at the same time, in terms of the Arctic Council, there are no discussions about national security and defense issues. And so a full complement and an opportunity for a more frank discussion may be viable through exploring this effort of a zone of peace. It has been an objective since our inception in 1977, largely due to the Cold War and the lack of participation of our Siberian Yupik relations, our direct blood relations on the other side of the Bering Strait. Sorry to be
Thank you so
long-winded.
much, Dr. Duro. Unfortunately, I am out of time, but it is a beautiful vision and I hope it is accomplished. Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for holding this very important hearing.
Thank you, Representative. The chair now recognizes Representative Dan Muser for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Keating. I appreciate being with you all, and thank you to our witnesses. So I think throughout this testimony, we've seen the Arctic is clearly increasingly become a focal point for a great power competition. Russia has increasingly engaged in energy development in the region and regularly conducts military exercises at their, what we might be able to say is many Arctic bases. China as well has made its Arctic interests known, seeing the potential for new trade routes. As an Arctic nation, the United States must protect and advance our interests and push back against such interference from potentially malign actors such as Russia and China. The Arctic may hold as much as 13%. We don't know, but that's an estimate of the world's undiscovered oil reserve, 1/3 of undiscovered natural gas reserves and critical minerals. So, Mr. Coffey, if I may, what role could Arctic oil, gas, and mineral resources play in global energy and resource security?
Well, thank you for that question. If you're a nation that's dependent on the goodwill of Russia providing your oil and gas, then I would say the opportunities for using the Arctic to diversify or become more energy secure are not very good. Half of the world's landmass and half of the world's Arctic coastline is in Russia. And Russia has not shown a willingness in any meaningful way to be a trustworthy partner when it comes to energy matters, especially for Europe. Right now, China is the main country that benefits from Russia's oil and gas facilities in the Arctic region. And the reason why China benefits from this is because of the pressure that Western economic sanctions has placed on this sector inside Russia, which has forced Moscow to almost go to Beijing with a begging bowl. Right now, Russia is very much the junior partner when it comes to the bilateral Russian-Chinese relationship. And a lot of that is built on the oil and gas that's in the Arctic that China needs and Russia needs money and investments to extract.
Mr. Coffey, who's in numerically, who's stronger, has got more knowledge and more of a footprint in the Arctic, China, Russia, or the United States?
Without a doubt, Russia. China's main motivation in the Arctic is still one of economics and trade and energy. To the best of my knowledge, I do not believe that the PLAN, the People's Liberation Army Navy, has even operated in the Arctic Ocean. Certainly, civilian vessels, civilian scientific exploration vessels that could easily be dual-hatted have operated in the Arctic Ocean, but the Navy itself, I don't think has. whereas Russia has spent a vast amount of money, time, and resources militarizing the Arctic region. And I just want to stress, as long as Russia does its militarization inside its own borders, that's Russia's prerogative. But it's when you look at Russia's activities in other places outside of its borders, such as Ukraine, Georgia, Syria, Belarus, for example, that gives you reason to be concerned by Russia's activities in the Arctic region.
Certainly, we have to certainly anticipate that they will look after their interests, and the United States must look after ours and assure that their interests don't overcome our interests. So how would you assess then the state of U.S. readiness to enforce our interests in the Arctic and counter the increasingly, what might be able to say, brazen Russian actions?
Well, we can't do it alone, as was already mentioned. We need to work with our partners and allies, especially in NATO. And we also need to make sure that we have adequately resourced maritime capabilities and air and ground capabilities designed and equipped to operate in the harsh environments of the Arctic region. Are we there yet? No, we're not. Are we seeing increases in funding to get us to where we need to be? I would say yes, we are, but it's going very slowly. And as it pertains to NATO specifically, right now the alliance is undergoing a strategic concept review, where it's going to publish next year a document that is meant to guide the alliance for the future threats that it might face. And this would be a good time for the alliance to finally recognize the Arctic region, because NATO has the responsibility to defend Svalbard in the same way it has the same responsibility to defend Sicily.
All right. Are we, in your view, effectively managing with our NATO partners the interests of the NATO partners versus Russia and China? Or do we need a far better plan and need to be more aggressive carrying it out?
And if you could limit that to 30 seconds, since time is over.
I'm sorry, Chairman. I thought I had a minute left.
Okay. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
We need a better coordinated plan and more resources directed at the unique challenges that the Arctic region faces, for sure.
All right, thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Chair now recognizes Representative Dina Titus for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been a very interesting hearing. You've talked a little bit about, Dr. DeRoe did, about the impact of this increased traffic on the indigenous people. I'd like to carry that just a step further. And it might seem mundane, but if we don't get ahead of it, it will become increasingly a problem. So to Dr. DeRoe and Dr. Natali, as we see more people in the Arctic, whether they're on scientific expeditions, it's military training, shipping of business interests, and I would venture to say you're going to have increased tourism there too as it becomes more accessible. What are we doing? Who's responsible for? Do we have the infrastructure to be sure the place doesn't just get trashed like we've seen in parts of the world where suddenly everybody wants to go there?
Mm-hmm. That's a really important question. Thank you very much. And before I get into any further details, I think this is the other element of UNCLOS that's significant. Many forget that UNCLOS isn't just about real estate. It is about numerous other chapters in terms of protection of the Arctic marine environment, for example. I think that the increased shipping, the increased vessel trafficking, including tourism and not just commodities in and out of the Arctic region, has numerous effects, diverse effects. Interruption of marine mammal habitat threatens our food security. I mean, if we look at the Bering Strait alone and walrus and the reliance upon walrus, never mind whaling, sealing, and a host of other harvesting activities. At the moment, we don't have the infrastructure necessary even to enforce the Polar Code. We welcomed the Polar Code, IMO's efforts to not only address issues of protection of the marine environment, but safety of life at sea, the infrastructure isn't there. Who's going to provide the infrastructure to ensure that there's safe discharge of gray water, for example? Hence my earlier comment about the lack of infrastructure. So this question is of central concern. I will note that fortunately, through efforts of the Coast Guard and their dialogue and consultation with communities that our communities that will be impacted by increased vessel traffic, identification of lanes. This exercise, I think, has to take place throughout the whole of the coastal areas that we as Inuit rely upon. So efforts across the whole of the Arctic should be taken to gain the input and the knowledge of our people as to safe passage, where there's less disruption. But I think your question is important in terms of ensuring protection of the Arctic Ocean and the coastal seas, or essentially the marine environment overall. And in my estimation, that's some of the value of the provisions and the other chapters of UNCLOS that many don't pay attention to because we're more concerned about the high politics that have emerged in the region. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Dr. Natali?
Yeah, if I could just add, yeah, and thanks for this question. If I could just add talk about a little bit about the impacts on Arctic lands. You know, in the Arctic, the ice is infrastructure, right? So we're building these structures on ice that is rapidly freezing. And so it's something to keep in mind that both is, you know, increasing effects of climate change is putting the current infrastructure at risk. As we go in and build this infrastructure, though, we're also impacting the environment. And so the climate change can thaw the permafrost, but the infrastructure also can cause impacts. And it's not an impact that goes away the next year when the vegetation grows. When you thaw that ice and when that ground collapses, you've then committed yourself to a lifetime, many lifetimes of impact on that land that may not come back. And so this is something to be concerned about. It's extremely difficult to turn the clock once the land has started to erode and once the land has started to collapse.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think it's something we should make a priority as we talk about our involvement in the region, not just our vis-a-vis Russia, but maybe some collaboration. Admiral, could you just add to that? You were mentioning add how we're going to keep the lanes safe as more and more traffic is there. Who's going to be our traffic cop in the Arctic to be sure we have safety with all this increased travel and traffic?
Yeah, thank you, Congresswoman. The Coast Guard, working with IMO, we have established a traffic separation scheme that goes through the Bering Strait. So if you're northbound, southbound, it's like interstate highway. You keep to the right to minimize a collision at sea. The bigger challenge is, well, what happens if we have a maritime incident, an oil spill? I was in charge of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and at my disposal, I had 49,000 responders, 6,500 ships. I could maybe at best get 50 responders in any of the villages that would be impacted by an oil spill in that part of the world, in the most pristine environments, and yet the most unforgiving environment when it comes to doing any type of pollution response. So the more we can do on prevention, which includes safe ship routing, the better prepared we will be. But the human factor will always have a role in that.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative. Chair now recognizes Representative Dean Phillips for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Greetings to our witnesses. I think we all agree that the topic of today's hearing is of critical importance.
That was great.
And I believe we also all agree that we can't go it alone. Arctic and non-Arctic actors are going to increase their provocative actions and activities, especially as the Arctic becomes more accessible because of warming temperatures and diminishing ice, something we've already covered today. So it's clearly more important than ever to find opportunities of common ground and cooperation and shared interests amongst our friends and even our foes. That is exactly why I introduced the Arctic Diplomacy Act of 2021 to establish a United States Ambassador at Large for Arctic Affairs and increase U.S. strategic engagement in the region. I'm proud that the legislation has been included in the Eagle Act, which we of course passed out of committee, and that the Arctic diplomacy strategy from the bill was also included as an amendment to the recently House-passed NDAA. And of course, with Russia currently chairing the Council, the U.S. has to be mindful about our diplomatic presence. So first question to you, Mr. Coffey, how will having a senior department official with the rank of ambassador at the table be favorable to the United States and also to the free world?
Well, it would be very welcome because it would put the United States at equal level in terms of diplomatic status with other Arctic nations around the world. And I think it would be a beneficial way for the U.S. to exert diplomatic influence when we debate issues related to the Arctic.
I appreciate it. Admiral, to you, how can the DOS and DOD complement each other relative to priorities in the Arctic?
Yeah, Congressman. Well, we're already doing that, and I think the platform we used was the Arctic Coast Guard Forum to build trust building measures, doing at-sea operations with the Coast Guards of all 8 Arctic Council nations. To your previous question, we need to revisit the Arctic Executive Steering Committee, which went into hiatus for a period of about 4 or 5 years. It was reactivated in September of 21. As I said earlier, chaired by Career Ambassador David Bolton, who has the bona fides that you alluded to in terms of ocean policy and Arctic awareness. And it was also our envoy when Russia last chaired the Arctic Council. So we have good continuity there. And so there may be an opportunity as we look at, do we have the right breadth and depth in the Arctic Executive Steering Committee so we don't create, competing frameworks with the focus area on the Arctic domain.
I appreciate that too. And Mr. Coffey, any thoughts on that response?
Sorry, I had a bit of delay in the connection. No, I think that we are seeing more synergy between the two, and I think that is a positive thing. And we're only now starting to understand some of the. We're only now starting to understand why many of the challenges we face in the Arctic require not only this multilateral approach that we talk about on the international stage, but more of an interagency approach inside the U.S. government, but also more coordination with the states at the state level and sub-state level, like with indigenous communities and also local authorities and municipalities and counties in Alaska.
Thank you both. Last, to Dr. Natali, of course, COP26 just wrapped up. I would welcome your thoughts relative to the Arctic-related outcomes and commitments on the heels of the summit. Any perspective you want to share, I'd welcome it.
Yeah, so the last IPCC report, AR6, did account for carbon emissions from permafrost, but not appropriately. So I think that's something that really needs to happen. I think in our conversations about, whether we're going to make it to 1 point or keep temperatures below 1.5 and 2C, we need to start fully accounting for carbon emissions from the Arctic, which currently still is not happening. And then I think the other thing I'd like to see more conversations on is just about loss and damage of Arctic lands as a result of erosion and permafrost. And I think that there was more voices of Arctic indigenous people, I think, at this COP, but I think that needs to be stepped up quite a bit more.
Thank you. And I want to thank all our witnesses for helping us elevate this important issue and for all the work you do. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative. Chair now recognizes Representative Brad Schneider for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the committee for holding this important hearing. I want to thank the witnesses for making your time, sharing your perspectives and views on this important issue. As I've read the testimony last night, as I listened to the question and answers today, it seems like we're facing a lot of dichotomies, not just the dichotomy of freeze versus thaw, but you've got the issues of climate change leading to challenges in preserving a pristine wilderness versus utilizing the opportunities presented. You have challenges of opportunities presented, but the threats coming from both climate change and global competition. Mutual shared interests of the countries bordering the Arctic and the challenges to sovereignty. And ultimately, it comes down to the balance of stewardship. How do we preserve and deal with these threats versus global competition? And I think those are some of the challenges, and I appreciate the input you all have had here. If I can turn to Admiral Zunkel, and thank you for your service and the perspective you bring to this conversation. Given, if I take it even a step further, the biggest challenge and purpose of this hearing is to talk about climate change and the impact of security. You have experience both in the Pacific, Atlantic, Gulf of Mexico. How will climate change affect not just the Coast Guard's ability, but our national ability, achieving our mission, operating? You've touched on some of that, but at the end of this hearing, if you could just wrap it up very briefly.
Well, thank you, Congressman. I think as we heard earlier, due to the challenges of just accessing the Arctic to begin with, almost defaults to a military role, be it search and rescue, an oil spill response. We have 31 villages, 12 of which are looking at moving to higher ground. All of those would fall under what we call the defense support to civil authorities, yet another mission for the Department of Defense to look at. So often we just look at the Arctic as pure competition, but we actually also have a responsibility to the residents in the Arctic domain as well, to some of the most prescient threats that they face right now. Everything I look at as greenhouse gases go up, there's a linear relationship between that temperature and sea level going up. What happens when sea ice retreats, it's that natural breakwater for these coastal communities that no longer exist. And now they have harsh storms that are literally washing these villages into the sea. The whale hunting, walrus harvesting, they have to go further offshore. The Coast Guard now seasonally places a squadron of aircraft in Kotzebue, which we never did before, because these villagers have to go much further and are at greater risk out there as well. We did put 3 CubeSat satellites into space that pick up search and rescue transponders to improve our, where are they? But the response times are still significant. Hundreds of miles from the nearest deepwater port, Dutch Harbor, to the north slope of Alaska. So challenges still remain in terms of any sustained presence in the high latitudes.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And maybe if I can turn to Dr. Natali, from a preservation standpoint, the ecology of the Arctic, the idea of stewardship versus competition, how does that play out?
Yeah, I mean, I would prioritize stewardship. I feel like the long-term security risks are much higher, both in the Arctic and globally, if that's not prioritized. In terms of the different interests in the Arctic, it seems to me, and I think the Admiral has brought up a couple times about remote sensing, I do think many interests can be met with increased prioritization of satellite remote sensing, both at increased spatial and temporal resolution in the Arctic, because yes, there are some satellites now, and we do have a lot of information that's coming out of them, but because the Arctic is so far north, and it's dark, and it's cloudy a lot of the time, I think there's a lot of information, increased information we can get for all of these security needs that have come up in this conversation so far. So thank you.
And in the last few seconds, Dr. Duro, I mean, you represent the people living in this area. Would welcome your thoughts as well.
Well, I think that there are a host of different perspectives. I just quickly wanted to point to some resources that may be helpful, and in particular, the Status of Tribes and Climate Change report that has recently come out. I think this is a useful resource that helps to quantify the impacts of climate change. I think bottom line, inclusion of the voices of Inuit. I think this is a really, really important matter that hasn't been fully explored, and potentially this Arctic Diplomacy Act and the opportunity for focused and coherent and coordinated efforts would really assist not only the U.S. government and all of its branches, including all of the military branches, but inclusion of our voices in relation to all of these relevant and pertinent questions that have been raised in the course of this particular hearing.
Well, thank you. And Mr. Coffey, I'm sorry out of time, but I yield back to the chairman. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative. I just want to have one question in conclusion for a brief answer as a follow-up. And that's this, that particularly with Admiral Zumkov and with Mr. Coffey, from the security standpoint, the emphasis was the advantage the U.S. has in the Arctic is the strength of our allies. So I want to ask Dr. Natali, and I want to ask Dr. Dura, what about the strength of our allies and our cooperation in dealing with the indigenous community and the scientific community? Is that as strong as it has to be? Is that on a par with what we've discussed in terms of our security alliances? Is that kind of cooperation and information sharing and coordination there for those important communities? Just the two doctors, if we could.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that more could be done in a substantive way. For example, the Inuit Circumpolar Council has become an observer to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We are shaping ways in which we can co-produce knowledge through our understanding of what we see and feel and hear on an everyday basis out there and on the sea ice and on the land. And I greatly appreciate Dr. Natali's reference to infrastructure and ice being infrastructure. This aligns with our perspectives, but I think that more could be done in order to recognize and respect our right of self-determination in research, meaning an embrace of Indigenous knowledge holders, an embrace of Indigenous knowledge generally. And we have presently a project to identify the ethical and equitable, fair and just engagement of Indigenous knowledge holders. And we look forward to sharing the outcomes of that particular project with all of those interested, not just in the United States, but indeed in a host of different intergovernmental fora across the globe. So we have much to contribute, including assessments and guidelines and protocols such as those emerging in this particular project. So more can be done.
Great, thank you. Finally, Dr. Natali.
Yeah, I think because the way scientific research is funded, there tends to be many individual projects, and there certainly is coordination amongst the scientific community. The Permafrost World, the Permafrost Carbon Network is one of them. But there's no strategic plan for addressing some of these issues, and there's no strategic plan for Western scientists and Indigenous scientists and knowledge holders to work together. So there's definitely examples of that happening. And there's definitely examples of collaboration with US and Russian scientists, say, but there's challenges, and there are challenges that individuals overcome. But I feel like there could be some more top-down support if this is a priority to make this happen. And I think we can advance the science and advance the protection of the Arctic and sort of sharing of knowledge of both Western and Indigenous knowledge if this was prioritized in some strategic way.
Well, thank you so much. I suspected in those two areas there's something perhaps in Congress we could try and encourage greater cooperation in those fields. It's clear from our security standpoint, as the Admiral said, and as Mr. Coffey said, we have a shockingly so, we have a lack of assets to deal with these issues. And we have a great deal of work to do from the security front as well. But the cooperation with our allies, particularly our NATO allies, is there. So thank you for this important testimony. We tried to make this one of our earlier hearings to highlight this and try and move the ball forward from this committee. It's an extraordinarily demanding time for our colleagues. And I just want to make note of the fact that we had 11 congressional members participating in this subcommittee hearing at a time when we're all being pulled in all kinds of different directions. And I think that speaks to the importance that we're placing on Congress and in this committee on the Arctic and the strategic and environmental, when they all overlap. I failed to put them into, I fail miserably in trying to just categorize it, because I think our witnesses as a whole have demonstrated the comprehensive importance of this. So strategically, we have a long way to go. Thank you so much for your testimony. Thank the members of the committee for participating. The members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous materials, and questions for the record, subject to the length and limitations of the rules. Again, thank you so much. Thank you for bearing out the time zone differences, many of you, and thank you for your important testimony. And you're welcome to continue to communicate with the subcommittee on this important matter. With that, I would declare this hearing closed.
Quyana.